Pop punk is a genre which has had a surprisingly long, complex, and even at times controversial history as it has evolved over time and has resulted in many offshoots and subgenres, and it has included many significant and diverse artists in the genre, ranging from the Ramones and the Descendents to Green Day and Blink-182, and to the Wonder Years, Hot Mulligan, and Machine Gun Kelly. In this video, I describe and analyze pop punk's history and development, as well as the ways it has evolved and changed stylistically and culturally from its inception to the present day. Some of the earliest punk rock bands in the mid to late 70s have been retroactively called pop punk and can be thought of as perhaps the first pop punk bands, such as the Ramones and the Buzzcocks, both who had a catchier and more melodic take on the punk rock sound that was influenced by the poppier sounds of the Beatles and the surf rock sounds of the Beach Boys. These early pop-influenced punk bands were influential on later bands like Green Day and Screeching Weasel, who were also very influential and who were both initially signed to Lookout Records and who would both become important for bringing pop punk to the mainstream. And the California punk scene in general was very important to pop punk's development, which was where many important and influential 80s and 90s punk and pop punk bands originated, including Bad Religion, the Descendents, Green Day, The Offspring, and Blink-182. Many people think of the Descendents as the first true pop punk band, as beginning with their album Milo Goes to College in 1982, along with their melodic take on punk rock, they also helped provide a lyrical and cultural foundation for pop punk that was distinct from the arguably more serious and heavy topics of punk rock and hardcore punk by writing a mix of relatively light songs and angsty lyrics about rebelling against parents, young love, and isolation, and they were very influential on many later bands, particularly Blink-182. At the same time, skate punk, a variation on punk rock and hardcore punk that also became associated with pop punk, and which featured fast guitars and surf-influenced drums, initially developed in the 1980s from melodic hardcore and melodic punk bands, including the previously mentioned Bad Religion, the Buzzcocks, and the Descendents, in part out of punk culture's consistent connection with skateboarding and skater culture as well as surf culture in California, and by the 1990s it further emphasized its melodic aspects and became more associated with many prominent punk rock and pop punk bands in the 90s and early 2000s, like The Offspring, Blink-182, Sum 41, NoFX, MXPX, and Lagwagon. Skate punk was also commonly featured in the soundtrack of the Tony Hawk video game franchise, which also helped continue its success into the 2000s. In 1994, with the massive commercial success of Green Day's Dookie and The Offspring's Smash, pop punk became mainstream with this initial wave of pop punk bands and following grunge's relative decline in the mainstream. These bands, who had many ties to punk rock as well as skate punk, faced criticism from the punk scene for their mainstream success and somewhat poppier sound compared to punk rock and for, in their view, selling out, and many of these bands rejected and even continue to reject the label to describe their music. Pop punk was, and to some extent still is, a controversial genre and term, largely because of the stigma surrounding it due to punk culture's concern with bands changing their sound and values and giving into corporate interests and or conforming to the mainstream, and embracing elements of pop was viewed as being at odds with the spirit of punk rock, which often viewed the term as kind of an oxymoron, and to a lesser extent this continues into the present day. It's only been more recently, since roughly the 2000s and increasingly since, when pop punk has become an accepted term that bands as well as their fans have mostly come to embrace, and where it has more clearly developed its own separate culture. The second wave of bands followed in the late 90s and early 2000s and was led by Blink-182 and their hugely successful and influential album Enema of the State, and also included prominent bands like New Found Glory and Sum 41, which were soon followed by the success of many more bands including Good Charlotte, Yellow Card, Bowling for Soup, and Simple Plan, where many of these second wave bands were influenced by first wave bands but arguably had more accessible production and poppier sounding songs than those earlier bands. This wave of bands came to clearly define both sonically and lyrically how people commonly think of pop punk today as being energetic, catchy songs with angsty and rebellious lyrics appealing primarily to younger people, while the anti-establishment and anti-conformity themes of punk rock were less of a focus. And this era was arguably when pop punk was at its peak in terms of cultural influence and relevance, with the crossover success of so many bands and their songs commonly being featured around this time in movie soundtracks and in video games as previously mentioned, and in other media. The following wave of mainstream bands in the mid to late 2000s were often thought of as being a stylistic blend of pop punk and emo. The success of Warped Tour, a tour which resulted in bands of many different styles ranging from punk rock and pop punk to emo, post-hardcore, and metalcore, touring together and being associated together, as well as with a significant overlap of fans and their cultural similarities, particularly between the two most popular genres of the time period among these, pop punk and emo, all contributed to the merging of pop-punk culture and emo culture by the 2000s, along with the newer scene subculture, which featured some elements of emo fashion like skinny jeans, side-swept bangs, and Converses, but combined it with big hair and bright colors, as well as internet culture and MySpace, in which was influenced by a range of diverse genres and cultures, but it was commonly simply viewed as an extension of emo culture. The relatively loosely defined term emo pop came into common use around this time as referring to a fusion of varying elements of the broadly defined emo with characteristics of pop or pop punk. And this term has been used to refer to several distinct waves of bands, including earlier bands like Taking Back Sunday and Brand New, who were directly influenced by poppier emo bands from the 90s and blended these influences with pop-punk influences, and also bands like Fall Out Boy, Panic! At the Disco, and Paramore, who were overall less traditionally emo sounding, as well as the pop-punk adjacent My Chemical Romance, and Fall Out Boy, Panic! At the Disco, and My Chemical Romance in particular took their pop-punk influenced music in a more dramatic and theatrical direction, and often continued the long, humorous song titles which perhaps originated in the emo scene with 90s screamo bands, and which Taking Back Sunday and Brand New had used, along with sarcastic lyrics with clever wordplay. Following this, in the late 2000s, there were bands like All Time Low, Boys Like Girls, Cobra Starship, and Hey Monday who took pop-punk in a poppier, more power pop influence and/or synth influence direction, which is often called neon pop or neon pop punk, and also featured pop-influenced lyrics that were more about relationships and dancing rather than teenage angst and rebellion, and this style is very influenced aesthetically by the bright colors of scene culture, along with the poppier elements of previous pop-punk bands, and represented a complete or near-complete departure from the original punk themes and sound dominant in initial pop-punk bands. While this subgenre largely fell out of favor by the early 2010s, some poppier pop-punk bands like 5 Seconds of Summer and Waterparks more recently have had a lot of success incorporating some elements of neon pop into their sound. At the same time that neon pop-punk developed, there was a more aggressive but still overall upbeat subgenre of pop-punk that also developed with a happier, more positive take on the otherwise typical pop-punk lyrics, which is most commonly called Easycore in contrast to the darker-sounding hardcore genre, and was primarily influenced by earlier pop-punk bands like New Found Glory and Sum 41, who blended catchy pop-punk riffs and melodies with heavier influences and faster and more intense drumming. And New Found Glory and their Easycore tour were the origin of the term in 2008, which featured prominent bands of the style A Day to Remember and 4 Year Strong, who gained success around the late 2000s. More specifically, Easycore is influenced by metalcore breakdowns and heavier singing styles influenced by metal or hardcore punk, as well as screaming, and occasionally also uses synthesizers. So throughout pop-punk's presence in the mainstream from the mid-90s through roughly the late 2000s, the genre and its culture evolved over this period to become less and less punk-influenced, where pop-punk bands were variously more emo or pop-influenced overall, and were much more influenced instead by scene culture, which was popular from around the mid-2000s to the early 2010s and dominated mainstream pop-punk during this time, in stark contrast to the punk culture which had been more dominant in the 90s. Pop-punk overall began to decline in mainstream popularity around the early 2010s, along with rock music as a whole, as electropop and dance pop became more dominant, and as an underground style, the genre developed a new subgenre that was very prominent in the pop-punk scene through the early and mid-2010s, which is sometimes called sadboi pop-punk, and prominent bands of the style have included The Wonder Years and The Story So Far initially, followed by bands like Real Friends, Knuckle Puck, and Neck Deep. And the style generally has represented a return to less accessible production and frequently uses an edgier vocal style with more hardcore influence than many mainstream 2000s pop-punk bands, with the notable exception of New Found Glory, whose faster and more intense take on pop-punk has been a significant influence on this style, and the subgenre is commonly influenced by emo as well, while the lyrics of the subgenre commonly feature more introspective, mature, and heavier lyrics, addressing problems in adulthood in contrast to many past pop-punk bands which often were lighter in tone and or more focused on the concerns of teenagers. More recent bands in pop-punk since the late 2010s and in the 2020s, like Hot Mulligan, who, following their recent significant rise in popularity, have come to be viewed by many as the leaders of the current 2020s pop-punk scene, as well as Spanish Love Songs, Origami Angel, and Arm's Length, who have retained similarities with previous sadboi bands but have arguably had more direct association and emphasis on emo elements, while also often being more influenced by indie styles. Around the same time that sadboi pop-punk developed, soft grunge, while not strictly pop-punk, developed in the early 2010s as an adjacent style which has been somewhat popular and blends several styles together, including pop-punk but also 80s and 90s alternative, indie, and punk styles like grunge, emo, shoegaze, and post-hardcore, and it developed in part from online culture influenced by hipster culture and indie sleaze fashion, which was popular at the time, as well as a revival of grunge fashion with prominent bands of the music genre including Title Fight, Citizen, and Balance and Composure. During the late 2010s and early 2020s, along with emo, there has been a pop-punk revival in the mainstream, which was driven in part by a general sense of nostalgia in culture and desire for throwback sounds, as well as the popularity of pop-punk on TikTok, and this revival was arguably led by controversial rapper turned pop-punk artist Machine Gun Kelly, whose 2020 album Tickets to My Downfall was very successful and was certified platinum in the US, and this revival also included newer artists like Jaden, Youngblood, and Kenny Hoopla. And Blink-182 drummer Travis Barker was also very important to the revival as he produced and drummed for a large number of these artists. Following the success of these artists, mainstream pop and pop rock artists like Olivia Rodrigo also began incorporating elements of pop-punk into their songs. The revival has been mostly separate from the more underground pop-punk scene, as it has been primarily associated with hip-hop influenced artists, and some older pop-punk fans have been skeptical of the revival and its commitment to pop-punk beyond following it as a fad, as well as its ability to meaningfully move the genre forward. Most of the pop-punk of this revival either was specifically influenced heavily by early 2000s pop-punk bands or combined pop-punk with elements of hip-hop such as rapping and trap-like production. In addition, similarly to emo and pop-punk in the 2000s, the emo rap and pop-punk revivals overlap significantly, with many artists incorporating both styles into their sound, and they also seem to sort of rise together as a mainstream trend and also arguably fall together, to the extent that there has been a perceived decline in the mainstream relevance of the revival, with some artists moving on from the style. And in addition to this recent revival, many older pop-punk bands like Green Day, Blink-182, and Fall Out Boy have continued to have success, especially over the last year or two, with both fans and critics, by returning to some aspects of their older pop-punk sound while combining it with some newer musical elements to varying degrees with their albums Saviors, One More Time, and So Much for Stardust, respectively, and this has helped to renew interest in the genre among some fans. So, throughout its history, pop-punk has evolved significantly, developed its own identity, and has expanded and shifted in meaning multiple times over the years, as it has been influenced by many different subcultures and genres, and has in turn influenced many other cultures and genres, beginning as a somewhat derogatory label that was dismissed and viewed as a contradiction in terms by some in the punk community that eventually has gone on to develop its own community and culture, and while it has gone through periods of varying mainstream relevance, it has continued to be successful and has retained older fans while continuing to gain new fans, while tours featuring the style have continued to be successful, including the When We Were Young Festival, the Sad Summer Festival, and the recent return of Warped Tour. Pop-punk has continued to appeal to both teenagers and adults across generations, and it has resulted in thousands of bands all over the world who have been and continue to be influenced by this music. Alright, well, thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and also subscribing if you want to see more content like this, and also please leave a comment if you'd be interested in sharing your thoughts about pop-punk's history, evolution, or subgenres. Alright, well, thanks again, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.